welcome to live programming here at the More Freedom Foundation. Please do let me know in the chat if I'm coming through all right. Today we're going to be discussing the question, is Ukraine good for the Middle East? I got very excited when I was planning this presentation about a Yemen ceasefire over the weekend. I would say, having looked into it a little further, I'm getting less and less excited. But what I want to do today is go through four dynamics that were already tremendously important in the Middle East that had sort of been shifting the Middle East from a status quo it had been experiencing really as long as I'd been looking at it closely. And then I want to talk about the ways that the Russia involvement Russia's invasion of Ukraine has actually accelerated all of these dynamics in a really interesting way. I think it probably overstates it to say that this is good for the Middle East, but it's at least different for the Middle East, and I think that can have a positive effect. Folks in the chat, can someone let me know that I'm coming through all right? Not getting chats saying that I'm doing all right, and that makes me nervous. Looks like my sound is coming through. Am I coming through on YouTube? Let's make sure we're doing that. But first, a few preliminaries. We're wondering if in case you're new here, you're allowed to say anything you want about me. You're allowed to say anything you want about my opinions, my appearance, what have you. Sorry, a little discombobulated. You're allowed to say anything you want about me. We're very open about the kinds of views that can be expressed because there's a war on. Let's not be openly genocidal about either side, but we're not policing for misinformation or what have you. What we do care about very deeply here is that you not be abusive of other people in the chat, and that you do not disrupt the chat. That's the main thing that matters. Okay, so it seems like I'm mostly coming through. The main thing is that you be civil to other people in the chat. I can't pay attention to what's going on in the chat while I'm doing my presentation. I'll probably get about a half hour, 45 minutes of talking, and then I'll dive into the live Q&A while I'll be paying attention to the chat. While I am focused on the presentation, Loga Cool Extreme is the moderator. There is no appeal from the court of Loga. Whatever Loga Cool Extreme says goes. If he identifies you as someone who's being abusive in the chat, he will tell you about it, and you should listen to him, because if you don't, he will block you. And as I said, there is no appeal. So anyway, let's get into it. The Middle East has been obviously in a state of fairly extreme crisis for quite some time. In the first decade of this century, you had violent U.S. adventuring in Iraq. In the second decade of the century, you had violent U.S. adventuring in Syria and Libya, in Yemen. But added to that, you also had the extreme hope and then the extreme disappointment of the Arab Spring. And of course, all of this is on top of a larger dynamic that has been present since 1979, and the conflict between Iran and Israel, Iran and the Gulf monarchies. It's been quite a mess, but what's sort of been interesting in recent years is watching the conflict shift. I think that it's beginning to shift. We see these shifts sometimes quite quickly and quite dramatically, as we saw in the first months of, I guess, the last month of 2010. Whenever the grocer in Tunisia set himself on fire to launch the Arab Spring, either in very late 2010 or early 2011, that was a quick, massively quick shift in the dynamics in the Middle East. What I think we've been seeing in recent years in the Middle East is a slower dynamic, a slower shift that's more about exhaustion than it is about anything else. It's about certain dynamics that have been very present, very important, very powerful conflict dynamics throughout the decade have just sort of been fading over the past 3 or 4 years. And what is interesting is considering the ways that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is actually sort of finally providing the accelerant, the way to sort of push these dynamics over, whether it's realizations by powers, attempts by powers to shift diplomatic dynamics, become friendly with folks that they'd been had animosity towards. I do think that the Russia-Ukraine thing is forcing sort of the Middle East into the future in ways, but they are in ways that had already been happening. So what I really want to focus on today is just four really important dynamics and the way that Russia has accelerated each and every one of those dynamics. The first dynamic is the growing realization, and this is something I've been harping on a lot. This is not a new topic for those of you who might be fans of this channel, but the oil price simply is not going up. This is, of course, seems counterintuitive if you're mostly paying attention to the business press, which is largely oriented around oil traders who want to tell you that every move, every single move in the oil price is some new dramatic thing that's never happened before. You'll often find that if you just go look at like oilprice.com and look at a 6-month period, you'll find that those shifts are not as dramatic as being sold. And especially if you look at an 8 to 10 year period, you'll see that everything that everybody's hyperventilating about is in fact not as serious as is sold. To be clear, I'm not saying that the rise in price of oil and gas assets over the past year, and especially over the past month, is not dramatic, is not significant. I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is that in the context of the history that countries like Saudi Arabia, like OPEC more broadly, might be used to, this is nothing. This is just nothing. I think the key thing to keep in mind is in the direct aftermath of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we saw oil prices spike up into the 120s, which is obviously something we have not seen for 8 years. But that does not mean it was an all-time high. That does not mean this was as bad as it had ever gotten. I looked this up. This was a quick bit of Googling. I'm not entirely certain whether this is inflation adjusted or not, but my understanding is that the all-time high for oil, I think this is Brent. I think Brent and WTI were fairly close back then. This is before shale really came on. But the all-time high was $145 for a barrel of oil. In the aftermath of Russia-Ukraine, we've made it to $120, $130 very briefly in intraday trading, made it to $130. But keep in mind, inflation is a very important thing, and oil is a dollar-denominated asset. So in the context of 14 years since July 2008, that's 14 years of just normal inflation is 1 to 2% a year. And certainly over the past year, we've gotten 7%. So in fact, hitting 130 to actually match those July 2008 prices, we'd have to hit $200 a barrel. And I think what's the dynamic of the oil price not going up to the levels that Saudi Arabia or OPEC or the United Arab Emirates might want or might consider to be appropriately high oil prices is something that was already just getting hammered into them over the past decade. It's important to point out that July 2008, when those prices got to those obscene highs, in July 2008, there weren't any sanctions against Venezuela. There weren't any sanctions against, there weren't any sanctions against Venezuela. There weren't any sanctions against Iran. Allow me to qualify that. There were sanctions against Iran, but it was a situation analogous to what we have with Russia and Ukraine right now. There were no sanctions on Iran's oil and gas industry. because back in 2008, we actually lived in a world of oil and gas scarcity. And it was like the whole world was like Germany is today with Russian gas. They just simply couldn't imagine and could not contemplate the possibility of um, a real shift in a real shift away from oil and gas. Geopolitics just simply weren't important, or rather, geopolitics were so important, and the recognition was that if any oil or gas supply anywhere in the world was interrupted for any reason at all, even mildly, oil and gas prices would go through the roof. I remember one of the biggest dynamics in the oil and gas markets of the early 2000s was Nigerian rebels in the oil and gas area. I mean, we don't even, it wouldn't be surprising to me if, younger folks who've only been looking at this for a little while might have already forgotten that Nigeria was a oil and gas producer. But in the 2000s, it was a tremendously huge factor in everything in the world, not because Nigeria would stop producing entirely, but because intermittently there would be, I'm not sure if rebellion is the appropriate way to refer to it, something somewhere in between piracy and a militia. Nigerian factions within oil producing regions would take a pipeline hostage or do some kind of, take out some bit of production. And just like a single aspect, a single pipeline, a single region of Nigerian oil and gas production going offline or being threatened mildly would yield incredible price hikes. So in that context, in the 2008 context, you can't possibly imagine, you couldn't possibly imagine, no matter how angry you were at Iran or Venezuela or Russia or Saudi Arabia, you couldn't imagine putting any kind of restrictions on the ability to sell oil and gas. We left that world. We left that world a long time ago. The whole dynamic, not just Trump's sanctioning of Iran, but the whole Obama multilateral sanctions against Iran, the whole JCPOA Iran nuclear deal. As much as Saudi Arabia enjoyed not the deal, but the sanctions that were put on Iran prior to, the fact that Iran's sanctions even existed in the first place, going back to the Obama administration, was a sign that we were leaving a world of oil and gas scarcity. And over the past 8 years, that has been emphasized over and over and over again. The JCPOA sanctions process was brought roaring back by Trump in the context of very, very low oil and gas prices. I made a video a number of years back talking about how Trump is the OPEC president. It seemed like the only through line of Trump's foreign policy was to find oil and gas resources, countries that produced oil and gas, and knock them out of the market. That was what he did in Iran. That's what he did with Venezuela. There'd been many kinds of sanctions against Venezuela for years and years, perhaps even a decade or so, going back to George W. Bush. But nobody dared to knock out Venezuela's oil and gas supply to the United States, because that was the different world. That was the older world we lived in. Trump did that. Knocked out it was the Venezuelan oil market had been falling apart, but there was still about 1 million barrels, I think, a day that they supplied to the United States. We ended up having to replace that oil, of course, with Russian oil. But yeah, Trump completely knocked Iran out of the market. I mean, there's a lot of black market stuff going on with Iran, but he did really almost completely knock Venezuela out of the market. Mostly because Venezuela had almost already knocked itself out of the market with poor management. And also I think we're at the 3-year anniversary now, this week, of Trump endorsing Libyan strongman's attempt to take all of Libya. It was a complete failure. We'll talk about that more a bit later. But this is the 3-year anniversary, and that knocked another 1.5 million barrels of oil out of the world market. And all of that, keep in mind, July 2008, all-time highs. taking Iran off of the market, taking Venezuela off of the market, taking Iran off the market, Venezuela off the market, Libya is now back on the market. But all of this together did not yield prices that were certainly not as high as 2008, but even as high as 2014. Just simply didn't happen. And this is for folks who, again, remember, in the 2000s, if a single militia in Nigeria, threatened a pipeline, prices would go haywire. It's a very different world. And a really key thing. So across 2014, from 2014 until 2022, we had not just a failure to reach all-time highs in oil and gas, we had a failure to breach, even in nominal terms, that $100 a barrel point. What happened in 2020 was quite extreme. We actually had, due to the way that futures contracts work, we had a month or two with the COVID crisis where I think it was just 1 month where oil prices, the price of a barrel of an oil, went dramatically negative. This was obviously kind of horrifying for any oil producer, but it actually gave Saudi Arabia and the UAE something that they'd been working for 8 long years. The dramatic crash in oil prices from between 2014 and 2016 was a result of Saudi Arabia and the UAE desperately attempting to preserve their market share against U.S. producers of shale oil and gas. What they wanted to do was drive the shale, the sort of U.S. energy independence, blah, 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 that new aspect of the U.S. oil and gas market. Saudi Arabia wanted to drive it out of business. This was the plan. This was the hope of what they could get away with in 2014 to 2016. In 2016, famously, they had to give up on doing that because the U.S. oil producers proved to be more flexible than anybody had expected. And, Saudi Arabia would keep driving the price down by flooding the market, and the shale drillers would keep matching it. Sure, it would work momentarily, but then folks in the United States would figure out new innovations, new ways to do things cheaper, and it was murderous. Not so much for Saudi Arabia, which still had many financial resources in 2014, 2015, 2016, but certainly for every other producer in the world, as sort of Saudi Arabia and Texas sort of dueled it out. Well, thanks to this tremendous crash in 2020, Saudi Arabia finally got its way. Saudi Arabia finally scared Texas enough, or rather scared the Wall Street investors in Texas enough to stop producing the way that they had been producing, to stop this mentality from the 2000s that was still held on to in Texas, where it was just like, oh, we can produce as much as possible, somebody will buy it. What happened after that point in 2020 when oil prices actually went negative for a month, the Wall Street essentially looked back at the past decade of money that they'd just been shoveling towards the U.S. oil producers. And it was like, wait a second, we lost $300 billion here. They poured $300 billion into this market that just evaporated. Sure, a lot of oil and gas was produced, but even after considering how much was paid for all that oil and gas, even after totting all of that up, the investors in the U.S. energy independence miracle had lost $300 billion over the course of a decade. So what happened was they finally put in some discipline there, finally made it so that, what's the word here? They finally made it so that Texas was killed, essentially, or rather Texas's behavior as the Uber swing producer, where they would just simply always act to bring prices lower. It made it impossible for oil prices to get over $60 a barrel for a very long period of time, other than short spikes. Made it impossible to keep oil prices consistently over $60 a barrel, because at $60 a barrel, Texas would just start producing. Well, the crash to negative prices in 2020 got it to the point where Texas's now will start producing point is at about $100 a barrel. So Saudi Arabia finally won. They won their battle with Texas. After 8 bruising years, Saudi Arabia had won its battle with Texas, and we were in this strange situation coming into the fall of 2021, where Saudi Arabia had gotten sanctions on Iran that weren't being lifted by the Biden administration, despite promises. Sanctions against Venezuela that nobody was really thinking about. And they had beaten Texas. Saudi Arabia had beaten Texas. And all of that together had gotten to this point where oil was just barely getting up to like $90 a barrel. Again, that's like nominal, which is like in like 2008 terms was, I don't know, like $80 a barrel or something like that. Saudi Arabia getting everything they wanted, knocking out multiple competitors, still couldn't get oil prices above $90 a barrel. And now this brings us to Russia and Ukraine. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and also very importantly, Russia's threatened invasion of Ukraine. So I think it's sort of October or November of 2021 until the actual invasion in February. We did have rising threats, rising difficulty, rising tensions. Now, remember what I said back in the 2000s, if like a Nigerian militia threatened a single pipeline, that would send prices, skyrocketing up for months. Now we had, I know that Russia is one of the big 3. I can't recall if it's number 2 or number 3. But we have, one of the top 3 oil producers in the world threatening to get into a major war with a country crisscrossed by Russian pipelines. Can you imagine a huger, a more geopolitically fraught or dangerous situation than that, which obviously prompted everybody trying to fill all of their reservoirs, their strategic reserves, every container tank everywhere, trying to fill. Everybody buy as much oil and gas as they possibly could. And even with all of that, what we did see in the natural gas market is we did see the kinds of price movement that Saudi Arabia would have wanted to see. But those were sort of very temporary things related to, the wind not blowing for a week or so, or a range of other concerns. Germany's rather idiotic choice to close all its nuclear plants, et cetera, et cetera. So natural gas went a little bit haywire because natural gas is a much more complicated market than oil, where really don't want to overstate this. There are different grades of oil, different refineries prepared for different grades of oil. But more or less, if you can put a bunch of oil in a tanker, it is pretty fungible and it can go anywhere. Natural gas is a lot more complicated. Liquid natural gas requires a whole different sort of infrastructure. Pipelines go to certain places and they take years, if not decades, to build. Sort of a different market. But even with Russia and Ukraine, even after Russia invaded Ukraine, we've got Iran taken off the market, Venezuela taken off the market, Texas essentially not taken off the market, but brutalized away from its pump, no matter what have you. And then we essentially had Russia taken off the market. Now, of course, there's the important qualification that Russian oil and gas has very carefully, explicitly not been sanctioned yet. But like I said, remember, a Nigerian militia threatening a source, would send prices skyrocketing. Like, even though there aren't too many, the U.S. now has officially sanctioned Russian oil. Even though there aren't, Russian oil and gas is still technically supposed to continue to flow. There's self-sanctioning. There are players in the market that are just getting out because they don't want the risk, or they don't want the negative PR of dealing with Russia. Of course, India, China they're going to continue buying all the Russian oil they can. But there are oil pipelines that aren't going to function as well as they should. There are crucial expertise that was provided by international oil companies that Russia's no longer going to be getting. So this is, even though so far we don't have large-scale sanctions against Russian oil and gas, this is another, this is, and considering the size of the market, this is an even bigger deal than Venezuela being completely knocked out of the market or Libya being knocked out of the market for 6 months back in 2019. It is comparable to the Iran sanctions if the Iran sanctions had been completely successful, which they hadn't been. And that's sort of the extraordinary thing, is that with all of this, even with Russia going crazy, we haven't gotten oil prices up to $150 a barrel yet, even nominally. I mean, I predicted that, in the first week after the invasion, oil prices would hit $150 a barrel, and it didn't. Because even with my skepticism, and I'm like much more skepticism of oil markets. I'm much more lower for longer forever than most people. But even with my assumption that the oil market was just destined to be, the oil price just simply isn't going up anymore. Even with that conviction on my part, I thought oil prices would go higher with this insane escalation from Russia, this insane action. But it just didn't. Again, there's incredible pain at the pump in the United States and across the world. Prices have gone up to an extent because over the past 8 years, we've become so accustomed to such a low level of prices. Everybody in the U.S. drives an SUV, and now again, India, developing world, has gotten used to rock bottom prices for oil and gas. So don't get me wrong. There's incredible pain here. And I don't want to minimize that, but from the context of Saudi Arabia or the Texas shale oil producers, they got to look at all this and be like, honestly, that's it? Everything is going wrong in the world. Multiple huge oil and gas producers have turned themselves into pariahs, and everything in oil and gas is breaking. It's an incredible disaster. Something that would have meant $500 a barrel of oil in 2005, and that's it. Like, we briefly hit $130 a barrel of oil, and now it's sort of hovering around 100 again. To be clear, I mean the one of the reasons this has gone down so dramatically is that China is going into lockdowns again. That's a tremendously lucky thing for the world, obviously not for China, and well, really not for the rest of the world's supply chains. But for oil and gas, it's provided a really interesting governor on Russia's ability to be a bully and things getting truly out of hand. And what's also interesting about that is China shutting down at this point actually provides an adjustment period to the world. It's not 2005 anymore. The world is not incredibly dependent, is not as exclusively dependent on oil and gas as it used to be. It is very, very dependent on oil and gas. Again, there's a lot of real pain, but it is not as exclusively dependent as it used to be. And that is a very key distinction. With China's lockdowns, due to new COVID lockdowns, I think Shanghai has been locked down. What it's actually doing, I do not believe this is conscious. I don't think China would have chosen this. I was seeing some conspiracy theories along those lines. But what China has given the world by shutting down in this incredibly inconvenient way for itself is it's given the world a chance to adjust. Obviously, over the course of weeks or months, the world is not going to do a dramatic shift to oil and gas and turn on the nuclear plants, though they actually have been. Germany hasn't moved yet, but my understanding is that Belgium has. They had some plants that were planned to shut down, and they're going to keep them going for another 10 years. Things can be done in terms of more solar, more wind, more transmission lines can be done in the window of a couple months. I mean, famously, over the course of 3 weeks, Ukraine set up an entirely different electrical infrastructure. I haven't read down into the details of that, but my understanding is most logistics folks, from Peter Zeihan to the Bloomberg folks, have been kind of blown away by how quickly Ukraine was able to rig up an alternative electricity system that was more reliant on European sources than Russian sources. So, things can be done, and what the Chinese lockdowns have given the world is sort of a weeks or even months breathing period where we can adjust and get less dependent on oil and gas more generally. I think what's really important about this high price environment, people, I read there was a Odd Lots podcast where there was an analyst who was very skeptical of demand destruction, and I think he's out of his mind because what has happened over the past 8 years of rock bottom oil and gas prices is we've had everybody driving SUVs again, everybody driving big trucks, every person in the economic supply chain becoming accustomed to oil and gas prices being so cheap that they don't have to go for alternatives. Not everybody can buy a Tesla. There's a shortage of electric cars now. They can't build them fast enough in the United States. My understanding is there is actually more capacity in China and in Europe, and those are getting swallowed up very quickly. But you don't have to, and this is the key thing, even though this is accelerating the push towards electric cars, the push towards energy transition in every way, more solar, more wind, more nukes, more hydro, geothermal. Even though this is happening, you don't have to do any of those big ticket shifts to use less oil and gas. People are for the past month, every person who has purchased a vehicle has been like, do I need an SUV or can I make do with a sedan? Or I'm going to buy the SUV with better gas mileage. It's just little decisions like that. Little decisions like, what, maybe I'm going to install a heat pump in my house. Maybe I'm going to do this, that, and the other thing. And it's those tiny little decisions that are already being sparked by oil and gas prices that aren't even that high, historically speaking. So this is the dynamic. Sorry, I get, when I talk about oil and gas, I get a little long-winded. But I think this is the dynamic that Saudi Arabia had been facing for most of a decade now, which was like the oil price really isn't going up, is it? And now, with Russia invading Ukraine, with the United States banning oil from Russia, with a distinct chance, it's kind of interesting the extent to which we are already seeing Europe continuing to buy natural gas from Russia and attempting to shame other people for buying Russian oil, which is quite nonsensical. But you know what? Europeans and really any world actor is very capable of being that hypocritical and more. The huge push around very real and horrific human rights violations that we're seeing this week, that Russia has committed, that we're seeing this week, is also going to have a huge impact. And the chances of there being more real sanctions of oil and gas of Russia, see, and this is the important thing, it doesn't even have to be them actually happening. The possibility, if the market sees the possibility of real sanctions on Russian oil and gas, then the market should reflect that in its prices, and it just doesn't. So there's a lot of anger that I've participated in, perhaps a little unfairly to Saudi Arabia, but I don't give a fuck about being unfair to Saudi Arabia. But there's been a lot of anger at Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and also at Texas for not pumping more oil and gas, for not reacting to these market conditions by making huge investments and upping their production in dramatic ways. But the thing is, they see this, whether we're talking about Dallas or Riyadh or Abu Dhabi, they see this market and they're like, this is not impressive. This is not good. This is a brief problem that a lot of folks are having, that's going to last for a couple months. And if we go on stream and invest all these tens of billions of dollars in bringing more production on stream, yeah, it'll make things a little easier for the world for a couple months, but then it's going to destroy our pricing power. Because if their pricing power is already so small at this point, yeah, I mean, quite frankly, this gets to the something I've emphasized a lot, which is that Saudi Arabia is finished. Saudi Arabia and the UAE cannot operate the systems that they operate in this oil market, even in this oil market, and their expectation of what oil and gas prices have to be to justify them upping production. I'm saying like it's crazy, but it's also existential. Like they can't actually function in today's oil market, and Russia invading Ukraine has emphasized that, meaning their systems can't function. Like if Saudi Arabia had the government of Norway, then they'd be extremely happy right now, and would be also extremely happy with oil that costs $40 a barrel or $30 a barrel. But no, they have this extraordinary, extractive, medieval, ridiculous monarchy that is dependent on oil prices being this high or higher forever. And that's simply not the world that we live in. So I think that's a really key dynamic of Saudi Arabia waking up to how little power they have with oil and gas, and OPEC as well, and the UAE and Saudi Arabia as well. Just how little pricing power they have anymore. That dynamic, something they've been waking up to for a while, and it's still not going up. The other really key dynamic in the Middle East that's been developing is simply the United States just not fucking caring. In the Obama administration, this was active. This was Obama had a plan to actually get the United States out of the Middle East by making peace with Iran. It was a brilliant plan. It was extraordinary that he made it as far as he did. But he was stymied. He was his very smart, intelligent thing to do the Iran nuclear deal, get the United States the fuck out of the Middle East, was destroyed by the Republicans, was destroyed by Donald Trump, and even now, Biden's attempts to get back into that deal and get the U.S. the hell out of the Middle East are again being destroyed by Republicans who just are suckling at the teat of defense contractors. And not just Republicans, also Democrats like Bob Menendez. It was just sort of a failed effort. So what you've got in the United States right now is sort of there's a lot of things in the United States that are just on autopilot. The amount of soldiers that the United States has in the Middle East is one of those things. The thousand or thousands of troops we have in Syria and Iraq, but much more importantly, the tens of thousands of troops we have in Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, where else? I'm not entirely certain whether we still have troops in Saudi Arabia, but we've got something along the lines of 60,000 troops in the Middle East. None of them should be there, but they're all still there out of inertia. It's not because the United States really cares much about what's going on there. I think one of the most important events is the 2019 nominally Houthi, but I think as the time goes by, more and more people acknowledge that it was Houthi / Iranian, or really maybe just Iranian. But the Houthis Yemen's Houthis took credit. The 2019 attack on the Abqaiq, I don't know how to pronounce that, oil refinery in Saudi Arabia. My understanding is briefly knocked out 50% of Saudi Arabia's oil production, and actually briefly knocked out, so I think that comes to 5 to 10% of the world's oil production was knocked out by a missile attack. And at that point, I was like, oh shit, here we go. Here's the big war. And the Saudis were like, oh my God, look what Iran just did to us. And Donald Trump, their big fan, their big friend, Donald Trump was like, well, that sucks. So I think the United States has a lot of investment in the Middle East that just sort of continues out of inertia, the fact that Saudi Arabia and the UAE still have a ton of money that they use to bribe everybody in Washington D.C. And yeah, you can get Ted Cruz. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have the money to get Ted Cruz or Tom Cotton to get up there and be like, there'll never be a deal with Iran, which is incredibly stupid and damaging to the United States. But yeah, they can block things. They can keep the United States from doing anything proactive to actually extricate itself from the Middle East. But all of that money, all of those disgusting congressmen like Ted Cruz, Bob Menendez, and Tom Cotton that the Saudis own, they can't make the U.S. public or even the U.S. military care enough to shed a drop of blood for any of these, for Saudi Arabia or the UAE anymore. It's just simply not there. We just don't care. Yeah, but I think that's misleading, and I think even the Saudis get confused by that because there's two parts to that. I'm now getting to the point that yes, the U.S. Congress is too corrupt and too stupid to take the incredible opportunity of the JCPOA and extract the United States from the Middle East. It's just not going to happen. This, I think, is where I'm arriving. Even as I'm saying that now, I find it, I feel like it's probably just not going to happen. Or even if the JCPOA does happen, the Biden administration makes it happen, the Republicans are going to find some way to sabotage it to keep us in the Middle East, because that's how stupid the Republicans and Democrats like Bob Menendez are. But there's two parts to that. Yes, like we're not going to do anything positive to get ourselves out of the Middle East. We're not going to stop our murderous sanctions programs, because these things like our troop presence makes us money, or rather makes the Congress money. The sanctions programs may allow Congress people to sound tough while murdering children, but it's really easy in sound bites to attack people who are like, hey, let's stop murdering children. Like, oh, you must love Assad or the Iranians or the Venezuelans or whatever. It's really easy for that to happen. So that stuff's going to stay there. But the United States really doesn't care about Saudi Arabia in a positive way. To the extent, the more you learn about Saudi Arabia from the United States, the more you hate it. Really doesn't care about the UAE. The United States cares about Israel. We do, but actually there's this weird context where you don't actually want anybody to pay attention to what Israel's doing anymore. There's of course, the Israel-Palestine issue, which is perennial and forever, and you definitely don't want the U.S. public to pay much attention to that. But also, when you're talking about the way that Israel's threatened, and you talk about how this incredible threat that Iran poses to Israel, and then you actually look at what's happening with Israel right now, which is Israel basically completely freely murdering Iranian soldiers in Syria that are trying to prop up the Syrian government and keep it from falling into a nasty jihadistan. So you can't even there's nothing about the U.S.'s vestigial presence in the in the Middle East that is at all saleable. It's incredible opportunities for corruption, for the Congress, for the Pentagon, for the Gulf states, but you don't really don't want the U.S. public to have their attention drawn to the Middle East. We saw this. This is fascinating. In a couple weeks back, the Iran sent a whole bunch of missiles into Iraq in the vicinity of the U.S. consulate, and there was a whole bunch of people, whole bunch of standard DC think tankers who were like, oh, those fuckers, look, you can never trust Iran, da, 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 da. And then it came out very quickly that no, actually they weren't bombing the U.S. consulate, they were bombing a Mossad office in Iraq in retaliation for Israel obliterating a bunch of Iranian soldiers in Syria. So it was like this narrative that everyone really, it was like, uh-oh, here we go, another march to war for the dumbass set in Washington, D.C., and then they looked at it and they're like, oh, wait a second, if we talk about that, then we can't avoid talking about the fact that Israel started this. So let's just move on to Russia and Ukraine, And it's fascinating. There's nothing that the U.S. government can sell to the U.S. public anymore. The Islamic State was very charismatic and scary, but again, if you look at that in a little more detail, you're like, oh, wait a second, the Islamic State is charismatic and scary, and we created them by opening this open space for jihadis in northern Syria. Oh, shit. And I think that realization is even having an impact in Washington, D.C., because there's a lot of incredibly stupid people in Washington, D.C. I don't think they're evil. I think that they are, they just believe the hype, and their paycheck depends on them creating the hype. But I think even for people in Washington, D.C., like your sort of Atlantic Council people, your Brookings people, who are just like, rah, rah, yes, of course, we're the good guys, just can't look at the Middle East, can't look at Syria and be like, we're the good guys. Like, even these people who are just so blinded by, like, dumbass jingoism and their own paychecks can't look at the Middle East honestly anymore and be like, anything about the U.S. presence or involvement here is positive. So there's the oil price isn't going up. This dynamic of the U.S. doesn't care, and like, yeah, there's a lot of crap that we'll keep doing because it's a corruption opportunity, but for inertia. But we're not making any new, real big commitments to this place. And like, even if they, yeah, it's just not something that's viable. And what's really interesting is the way that Russia and Ukraine has accelerated this. The Saudis have been begging, honestly. I think there's a lot of reporting, and I think justly, around, oh, Saudi Arabia and the UAE aren't returning Biden's phone calls about the oil price, but because like Saudi Arabia keeps begging for scraps, not scraps. Well, they keep begging for things that would be a huge deal, but that are simply just not going to happen. Like, oh, they want a NATO. They want, Saudi Arabia wants a treaty commitment from the United States on the level of the commitments that we've made to European countries. It's just absolute nonsense. Like there's simply no way. Obama had to do a weird end run, a weird strange structure to justify doing the Iran nuclear deal. It's not a treaty. Like the idea that the Saudis, especially after the Khashoggi thing, would be able to get a treaty, this Khashoggi thing, the way everybody would, actually start looking at the Saudi role in 9/11 again, if those negotiations went forward, just the absolute absurdity of the idea that we were going to get a treaty commitment to Saudi Arabia and the UAE through the U.S. Congress is it's just nonsense. But that's sort of how desperate the Saudis are. They're just like, we desperately need something, some commitment. This foreign terrorist organization designation for the Houthis, something else that they're simply not getting. And what's really been an interesting dynamic over the past week is, I think, this sense of sort of Saudi UAE desperation sort of sinking in. I think, I tend to support the Houthis rather than the Saudis and the UAE in Yemen, not because the Houthis are good people. I think they're very bad people, in fact. I think a good connection, actually, is the Azov battalion in Ukraine. There are elements, specifically, not all of them, but a lot of the folks dying in Mariupol right now for Ukraine are really, really nasty people coming from organizations that are anti-Semitic, that are this, that, and the other thing, and I don't fucking care because they are indigenous resistance to an imperialist invader. And again, the Ukrainian military, I think, by and large, is not that. But there are, in small part, there are, neo-Nazi elements to the heroic Ukrainian defenders against imperialist aggression. The Houthis are a nasty organization that say really nasty things about Jews and Israel and the United States. But they are an indigenous resistance group. And by and large, I will always support an indigenous resistance group to an imperial invader over the imperial invader. Unless, the imperial invader is the United States, in which case I get a lot quieter. But I do have to concede, especially recently, that the Houthis are the block to peace in Yemen. in the past, exclusively in the past 3 years. Since the UAE pulled out, I think there's been scope. In 2019, the UAE, which is a much more competent military entity, the UAE and its proxies are much more competent military actors than Saudi Arabia. When they pulled back from leading offensives, they've always retained a presence in Yemen in 2019. When they pulled back, I think from that point on, a real ceasefire was possible. And the Houthis simply decided, fuck this, no, like we've survived this onslaught, we're just going to take back the rest of the country. And that has been the case with an ongoing battle for Marib. And if they do take Marib, they have taken almost all of the country. There's places in the south that the Saudis don't really actually control because it's mostly controlled by different groups. The sort of Saudi coalition controlled members of the Yemeni government. The most significant territory that they hold is in Marib. So the Houthis have been trying to take that for years. And I think recently, when it became clear that Biden was not actually going to do anything to stop this war in Yemen, Saudi and UAE money had managed to do that. That they were going to continue to get away with what they were going to be able to do. The Saudis and the UAE dramatically stepped up their efforts in this war. The UAE jumped back in. And even with all of that, even with taking back some territory from the Houthis around Marib, I think it's pretty clear to the Saudis and the UAE that this is not a war that they can win. They're looking for an honorable way to get the hell out. And the Houthis seem uninterested in letting them have even that, to the extent that it's costing the Yemeni people in really big ways. So what we had on Sunday was, after sort of dueling ceasefires, Yemen sort of put together a ceasefire, and then the Houthis, the real Yemeni government, the Houthis, did like a 3-day ceasefire that Saudi Arabia refused to participate in, and then Saudi Arabia announced a ceasefire that the Houthis refused to participate in, and then Hans Grunberg, the UN guy, finally got them both sides, to commit to, I believe, a Ramadan ceasefire, which would be amazing. And I think that it's just a real sign of exhaustion on the part of the Saudis. They've sort of the oil price isn't going up. The U.S. is not going to drag our bacon out of the fire here. I think Saudi Arabia is ready to give up on Yemen, and that is a phenomenal thing. The thing is that there are a lot of Yemenis who are committed to Saudi influence, who've been purchased and propped up, and the Saudis really don't want to have their own sort of Afghanistan moment or Vietnam moment, because Saigon 1975, the folks falling off the helicopter, Afghanistan 2021, the folks jumping off the plane, because I think that the Saudis at this point have probably about 5-10% of the Yemeni population that have been completely reliant on this outside invader. I think they really, they desperately want some kind of semi-honorable conclusion here. So, like, Saudi Arabia isn't the United States. They can't just sort of have a moment like that, like Saigon or Kabul, and just sort of move on, especially since for MBS, this was his first big initiative before he was even the crown prince. I think the Saudis are in a really desperate position there, but I think they are beginning to recognize that they've sort of lost. I think that there's a lot of, as I kind of expected, there's been a lot of violations of the ceasefire by the Houthis. But what's interesting, my experience of sort of years of ceasefires in Syria is that sort of, ceasefires are broken, and then the two sides very quickly use it as an excuse to just get rid of the ceasefire and continue fighting. It does sort of seem to me, and I could be entirely wrong about this, it does sort of seem to me as though, the Houthis are violating this ceasefire, and the Saudis are just sort of like, well, we're just going to keep sticking with it. Let's just pretend this is real. And maybe it'll eventually become real. And honestly, that's a strategy that could work if the Saudis don't rise to the bit. Rise to the opportunity that the Houthis are giving them to just start the fighting again. Then maybe the Houthis are going to be like, well, Jesus, like we can't be this transparently the aggressors. So I don't know. I think that's a really interesting. The way that these two dynamics are contributing to a chance. I'm not saying for sure, but a chance for a ceasefire and real peace in Yemen. These dynamics, the oil price simply isn't going up, even in the context of Russia invading Ukraine. The U.S. just doesn't care, and even more deeply does not care now that we've got a ability to look like the good guys, which we certainly fucking don't anywhere in the Middle East. We've got an opportunity to look like the good guys in Russia and Ukraine, and also I think that the numbers that get thrown around for the amount of defense stuff that UAE and Saudi Arabia purchase are very, misguided. I think Trump talked about, the Saudis are buying $100 billion worth of weapons from us, and then you actually did the math, and I was like, well, that was actually over 10 years, included a bunch of the stuff that Obama had agreed to sell. It actually wasn't that much. Like in Europe, every rinky-dink European country is giving us $10 to $15 billion worth of F-35 contracts. It's the Middle East. The whole point of the Middle East, not consciously, but I argue, the real point of the Middle East destruction over the past 10 years was to give defense contracts to the United States from the U.S. perspective. Europe is giving us all the defense contracts we could possibly want. So this dynamic of the U.S. already not caring and being kind of embarrassed about Middle East stuff has been accelerated by the Russia-Ukraine situation, where we get to look like the good guys and sell probably dramatically more weapons to people that we actually really do like, as opposed to these gross medieval satrapies. Another really important dynamic, wow, I've talked way too long on this, but the Arab Spring is over. This is sort of a really important dynamic. Over the past decade, fighting over the Arab Spring's legacy has been tremendously important. The whole point, I've got a lengthy video about this, Saudi Arabia and the UAE worked very, very hard for a full decade to crush every piece of Arab democracy. And on July 25th, they finally succeeded. Tunisia's democracy finally collapsed on July 25th. This is Tunisia, the place where the Arab Spring started, and actually the place that had a successful, I think they have a couple constitutions, or just one constitution, but a successful, peaceful transitions of power. Unfortunately, not a successful economy because of the flaming shit pile that Saudi Arabia and the UAE had made of their region and NATO and the US by destroying Libya. The final victory in the Arab Spring was July 25th, 2021, with the fall of democracy in Tunisia. And there's a whole series of dynamics that were very, very intense during the Trump administration that are just gone. Essentially, you had Turkey and Qatar on one side, and then all of the other Middle Eastern dictatorships on the other side. You had UAE, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, sort of battling against each other for, Turkey and Qatar, strangely, were supporting democracy in the Middle East, and the UAE and Saudi Arabia were fighting against it. And they won. The UAE and Saudi Arabia successfully crushed democracy in the Middle East. And what's kind of interesting is that for the past decade, Saudi Arabia and the UAE have been agents of extraordinary chaos. They have made everything worse. They've made Lebanon worse. They've made Yemen dramatically worse. They've made Libya worse by supporting Haftar. And I think there's a real recognition for Saudi Arabia and the UAE that this chaos that they created that was useful to them for destroying any movement towards democracy has now boomeranged. has now boomeranged, and now this chaos is sort of out of control, and is now that they've met their goal of destroying the Arab Spring and any possibility of democracy, the chaos that they have unleashed has created such miserable economic conditions that it's making a new Arab Spring likely, or if not likely, very, very possible. So now I think the Gulf monarchies, and sort of their deputy Egypt, are sort of recognizing that they've won, but they've what's the classic Tacitus line? They've created a ruin and called it peace, and it's just like, what the hell are we supposed to do with this nightmare that we've created? And it's an important aspect of this is that Turkey has sort of given up. Turkey is now, this is a dynamic that we've been seeing for quite some time. Turkey trying to make nice with Egypt, which is a country that had massive conflicts with. I mean, there was it seemed like, I didn't think it was serious, but it seemed like a threat of war as recently as 2020, as the fall of 2020, when Turkey went into Libya and crushed Egypt and Saudi Arabia and the UAE's proxy, Haftar. War was threatened. Now Turkey's trying to make nice with everybody. And what's interesting about the role of Turkey specifically is that now that we're not Turkey, unlike everybody else in the Middle East, has a serious serious role as a real European power. It controls the Straits of the Black Sea. It is a top 20 economy. It has a real military. It is the second largest military in NATO. It's a real country with real powers and real influence. And now there's a real European crisis. So Turkey kind of like, well, this is sad that, we tried to bring democracy to the Middle East and it failed. So fuck it, though. We get to go be a power player, and we get to go show up and bond with NATO leaders. And we get, that incredible, I think I talked about it in last month's live, this incredible 3-day kick where, Erdogan, Turkish leader who couldn't get his phone calls returned, had to like buttonhole people at the sides of G7 and NATO conferences to get a sort of like a grim photo op with another European or North American leader. In a 3-day stretch, he had the president of Israel, that's the ceremonial, it's not the prime minister, not the powerful guy in Israel, but still, the president of Israel come to Turkey to sort of pay homage to the Turkish president Erdogan, followed by the Greek president coming to Turkey, not for like as formal an occasion, but a photo op coming to Turkey, and then the day after that, the German chancellor coming to Turkey to talk to Erdogan. So Turkey's sort of whole Middle Eastern thing has a lot of legacies, a lot of things that are sort of going on autopilot, like the United States, that are potentially much bigger commitments and potentially much more damaging for Turkey, like its occupation of Syria, its big commitment in Libya. But wow, have they got invited to a better and more impressive party. And they just don't care about this Middle Eastern stuff other than while they have an economic crisis that they're dealing with. And if the Gulf monarchies want to give them more money, they're happy to have it. And that's what we've got with Turkey and Saudi Arabia. This is a dynamic that has been tremendously shifted by the Russia-Ukraine thing, and that's Turkey giving up Khashoggi, which is, I think, an underappreciated aspect of the whole Khashoggi controversy. The Washington Post writer and former member of the Saudi ruling class that was dismembered in a Saudi consulate in Istanbul, Turkey. It's underappreciated the extent to which Turkey drove that whole story. That was very much a part of the Turkish conflict with that is very much a part of the Turkish conflict with Saudi Arabia. Is the reason that the Khashoggi thing became such a controversy. And this was something I almost entirely missed. I'm very grateful to Foreign Exchanges, which is a great Substack that provides every 3 times a week. They provide like just an update of things that are happening in the world. So Turkey very quietly last week, or was it the week before, closed the case. The prosecutors recommended that the case against all these Saudi nationals who had murdered Khashoggi be moved to Saudi Arabia. Let the Saudi government handle that. And that's just Turkey just being like, well, we're out. And that's interesting because that's a very positive thing for Saudi Arabia. Like and UAE, they won essentially. They successfully destroyed democracy in the Middle East. But Turkey just sort of gets to be like, well, we tried. We're going to go be real big, impressive countries on this European stage that's super important. And Saudi Arabia and the GCC are like, oh, I wish I was in NATO. I wish we had a NATO. I wish the U.S. wanted to get into real military cooperation with us instead of just selling us shit we don't know how to operate. It's a very interesting dynamic. And to close, I can't believe I've been talking for almost an hour and 10 minutes, so I apologize. To close, this dynamic that was already a real concern that has been hugely accelerated is that the economy in the Middle East is nightmarish. This chaos that Saudi Arabia unleashed and the UAE used to destroy the democracy of the Arab Spring, well, they did it. They destroyed democracy in the Middle East. Now there's just chaos. Lebanon, I think I've told folks before, I did a real deep dive on Lebanon recently. Read a couple books, did a lot of research investigation, caught up on the status of things there, and it was honestly just too depressing. That country is, I think, during the horrific 15-year civil war from 75 to 1990, like there was at least something to hope for. And I don't see much hope. It's almost like the actors in Lebanon don't care enough to fight anymore, and are just looking for ways to get out. So Lebanon is a catastrophe. Syria is obviously a catastrophe. Iraq is a catastrophe. Lebanon is a catastrophe. Libya is a catastrophe. Yemen's a catastrophe. Egypt is not yet a catastrophe. It's just a dictatorship. But Libya is in better shape, but still a mess. Tunisia, democracy finally been crushed. Algeria probably looking a little bit up with oil and gas prices being a little higher. But yeah, it's just an unrelentingly grim situation. And this was before Russia invaded Ukraine. And I don't need to tell the folks listening here about the extraordinary food crisis that is expected in the coming months. Russia and Ukraine, I think, together add up to about 30% of the world's wheat production. I saw some interesting threads that maybe this is a little blown out of proportion, and in fact, the fact that we've known this was coming for quite some time. The Indians had switched. A lot of had really dramatically upped their wheat production, so something yada yada. But regardless, I don't think anybody can dispute that Russia and Ukraine being knocked out of the food export market has dramatically jacked up prices and will just add more stress to the chaos and misery that was already present throughout the Middle East that the Gulf monarchies created. So yeah, this sort of accelerates everything, and unfortunately, yeah, I don't think Ukraine was good for the Middle East, but it has certainly accelerated a number of dynamics that have sort of brought us into the new Middle East. I think that you can see this in Lebanon. You can see this in Libya, where Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and a number of actors acted for a decade to make things worse there. You've now, after a period of great hope in Libya, you've got a lot of the same actors that the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Russia traditionally supported, sort of acting up and trying to create a new government. But they're not getting the support, or at least not the open support from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, or Egypt that they used to. Because I think at this point, Saudi Arabia and the UAE are sort of realizing, well, they won that battle. Now they need to desperately They won the battle against the Arab Spring. Now they desperately need to create some kind of system in the Middle East that keeps the next Arab Spring from happening. And that is a much, much taller order than just breaking shit. Yes, and that's also, you've got this problem where I think that it's not quite explicit yet, but I think probably very much the case that while Saudi Arabia and the UAE desperately want sanctions against Iran to be preserved, I think they probably like sanctions against Syria to be removed. And you had the United Arab Emirates welcoming Syria to welcoming Assad of Syria for sort of a state visit, and Syria will be welcomed back into the Arab League. The problem, of course, is that as long as the U.S. maintains secondary sanctions, it doesn't really matter what the UAE or Saudi governments do with Assad. They can't give Assad a single dollar worth of reconstruction money until the U.S. stops sanctioning that sort of thing, which we have not. That's sort of how that inertia becomes a problem. All right, sorry. I can't believe I just blathered for an hour and 12 minutes, but I am done blathering. So we're doing questions. Any questions you might have? This is a public newscast, so obviously I tend to respond more positively to super chats. If you give me a question with a super chat, I will definitely answer that question. But let's look at questions we have now. Ali Razi, can you see a future, obviously a long time from now, when Arabs would ally with Iran because of Turkey's increasing power? Not really. I mean, Ali Razi, that would, so I got Ali Razi's question is, would the Arabs ally with Iran because of Turkey's increasing power? Turkey's power would have to increase a lot. I think that's actually, and I've run videos talking about this, like the incredible state of disarray in Lebanon, the incredible state of disarray in Syria that the United States is maintaining, with it just unthinkingly maintaining with its sanctions and its secondary sanctions, not just forbidding U.S. actors from interacting in the Syrian economy, but forbidding any economic actor anywhere in the world from interacting in the Syrian economy. I think Turkey is a strong country that will continue to be strong and survive, but Syria and Lebanon are both, to differing degrees, sort of failed states. So you can actually imagine if Turkey hadn't already been so burned by its experience in Syria, you could actually imagine a level of chaos cropping up in Syria and in Lebanon that would almost legitimately excuse me, almost legitimately allow Turkey to assert that they have to go in there and take control over these places that they historically controlled for 500 years up until 1918. Because, just to save lives for humanitarian purposes, which would allow them to be there forever. So in that context, with sort of the Turks allying with, if the Turks did that, if they took over Syria, then you could actually see the Arabs potentially wanting to ally with the Persians. But it's kind of interesting is that without the U.S. playing the incredibly destructive role that it continues to play, especially with its sanctions, without the U.S. doing that, there's still Iraq in between Turkey and Iran. There's still a number of, and I think that Iraq would be further infiltrated by Iran, if in the context where Syria fell apart completely. So yeah, I mean, it is interesting to think about these sorts of things, and it is interesting that I think that I think that Saudi Arabia is coming to the realization, and the Gulf markets are realizing that, as much as they dislike Assad and have spent a decade trying to overthrow him, if Assad were actually to be overthrown, which becomes a much more serious concern now that the Russians are distracted, at least, in their support for him, they are realizing, oh shit, we don't actually want him to be overthrown. So yeah, it's a very interesting question. Of course, something that I, as born and raised as a Zionist, something that I find kind of interesting is that, you see, the thing is, if the Arabs are looking to Turkey or Persia as their ally against the other, then the Arabs have already lost. It's already in the context of Arabs losing control over territories that they've had for a century. I think that honestly, and this is, I know I piss off a lot of people when I say this, like, I think there's a real scope when the Arabs have better governments than I think there's a real scope for sort of actual Abraham Accord type stuff, because, if there's the incredible rage at Israel is because Arab lands have been taken. What I can see, and I know Fadl would disagree with me highly, who thinks there's great hopes of pan-Arab excitement in the coming decades. I really do wonder, with this absolute ruin of a region that Saudi Arabia has provided, like the at root, if you take out the anti-Semitism and the religious nonsense, the real concern and legitimate concern that Arabs have with Israel is that they have taken Arab lands. Well, after a century of independence, I think we're in a very real situation where Persians and Turks are taking back Arab lands, potentially on a much broader scale than Israel ever did. And that, I think, provides scope and possibility for real common ground between Arabs and Israel. I don't know. That's probably incredibly over optimistic and not possible, but just saying, it's a possibility. It'd be nice if that happened. You saying some mad things here. I am saying some mad things here, but I think they're true. Savita, can't Biden make Iran deal without Congress getting involved? I heard Iran is mad that Biden has not put much effort into it. Yeah, well, the problem is that Biden needs Congress for a whole bunch of other things. And it's not just Republican intransigence, it's also the Democratic Party intransigence. And it's not a question of, with the Republicans, it's like, oh, I'm going to make this big public stink. But, there's only so much. I mean, Bob Menendez is a complete creature of the U.S. defense industry. And if you're going to let Bob Menendez let the JCPOA happen, then you're going to have to give Bob Menendez, this incredibly corrupt Democratic New Jersey senator, you're going to have to give him something else in return. And I think that the Biden administration thus far hasn't been willing to do it. Yes, the Biden administration can absolutely get back in the JCPOA 100% without Congress, but they also need Congress for other things, is I think the problem. And they just haven't been successful enough selling them on that. Super chat from Star Pulsaro. What can Mexico do to help the refugees stuck at the border, given that the U.S. does not want to accept them and they don't want to stay in Mexico? I mean, that's a huge question. And I'll confess that it's not. Well, I've certainly been making some shorts recently, and I think have one coming up on the border. The minutia of the sort of devilish details of the new Berlin Wall, the U.S. border. I just can't. I can't answer that question with any granularity, Star Pulsaro. And honestly, there isn't much that Mexico can do to stop. I mean, you've described a catch-22 sort of situation. The refugees want to go to the United States. The United States will not let them, and because of really one of history's most disgusting sci-fi dystopia borders, and a completely new thing. People just don't quite understand that this incredibly hyper-militarized sci-fi dystopia U.S.-Mexican border is barely 30 years old. Like this isn't. It's not older than I am. I mean, I was a teenager when this nightmare thing started being built. This nightmare border that has literally killed probably like 10,000 people, who have 10,000 people who could have been, could have been Americans, could have helped us with our labor shortage, could have helped reduce inflation, and the U.S. border murdered them. The U.S. Border Patrol, these disgusting government bureaucrats, murdered these potential Americans by letting them starve to death in the desert, trying to get to this country to do things for us. It's a really nightmarish experience that I'm more and more feeling like I need to talk about. Mostly, not that it's gotten more unjust or more evil recently, just because it's gotten to the point where it's now incredibly negatively impacting U.S. prospects in the coming century. It is a out of control government bureaucracy, the Border Patrol, that has growing power over the news media, growing power over the Republican Party, that is killing America. It's actually killing what's best about America. I would say that the U.S. Border Patrol is a bigger threat to the United States than ISIS. It's a bigger threat than China. It's a bigger threat than Russia. It is actively working to destroy what's best about America, and to destroy the source of American power. But like as far as like that, like I think at this point, Star Pulsaro, I just have to say there's nothing really that Mexico can do to help the refugees stuck at the border. And I don't think Mexico really cares that much. Mexico, Mexico is not the United States, but it's still America. And it is quite staggering. The flip side of all American countries is that we are extraordinarily welcoming to those who can come and succeed, and have things to bring. But we can be extraordinarily cruel to those that we've momentarily decided are not useful. And yeah, I don't know that Mexico's really that interested in helping the refugees. I think that AMLO, and perhaps because he's actually extraordinarily Trump-like, this is the Mexican president, actually had a much better relationship with Trump than was expected. And what can Mexico do to help the refugees stuck at the border? Yeah, not much. I think it's U.S. policy that needs to change. It's insane to me that we have out of control inflation because wages are rising. We have this incredible labor shortage, and we are spending tens of billions of dollars of useful U.S. dollars to keep people who could help us with those problems out. It's utter insanity. Have really Toad Films says have really been enjoying these live stream presentations. Do you also plan to start streaming on Twitch TV? I have no plans to start streaming on Twitch TV. I'm currently streaming here. I'm streaming on TikTok. I guess. I mean, I finally signed up for Open Studio. Does that easily do simulcast on Twitch? I suppose it wouldn't be a bad idea to do it on Twitch as well. But it's just another. I am 40. I'm turning 43 this year, and I'm already sort of at the bleeding edge of technical stuff that I barely understand. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess let me know in the comments, folks. Should I get on Twitch as well? I do feel that I've gotten a lot of value out of being on, honestly, making the switch in probably, I don't want to get too far into talking about my own stuff. That's more for the patrons only thing. But last fall, I was pretty close to quitting. I was pretty close to just saying, well, I tried. I tried for 8 years, and nobody's paying attention. It's not the fact that I love the amount of people that pay attention, the amount of people that show up for these presentations. I'm incredibly grateful to the folks who still show up. It's just what's frustrating to me is that this was a much bigger thing about 4 years ago. And it's for the past 4 years I've been like, sort of limping along at about, 10 to 25% the scale that I had 4 years ago, which is So anyway, in the past fall, I was considering quitting, and just starting these daily shorts and then uploading them on TikTok has been enough to convince me to keep going because it's seeing some real growth over at TikTok that has actually translated into bringing some growth back here, and of course, unfortunately, Vladimir Putin has also been very helpful by making people very much more interested in geopolitics. But yeah, so I don't know. Maybe Twitch should be another thing that would step me up. I just don't know anything about it. But I'm a little daunted. As Loga, the moderator and also the guy who runs our Discord server for the patrons, I can tell you, I need to be dragged into these things. But yeah, let me know in the comments if you think Twitch would be a good thing for me to do. My opinion on Algeria's future. That's a great question. It's funny. I think that for a couple of years now, I've been trying to make a video just talking about how dark I believe Algeria's future to be. I think that Algeria is not in a situation as bad as, say, Saudi Arabia. I think it doesn't have quite as insane or corrupt a system. Don't get me wrong, Algeria is very corrupt and somewhat, and sort of oligarchical, dictatorial, but nowhere near as bad as Saudi Arabia. However, the complexity of extracting Algeria's oil and gas resources, it doesn't have the runway that Saudi Arabia does, or volume of oil and gas that Saudi Arabia does, with a similar population. And up until 2014, Algeria's oil and gas resources were significant enough in that old oil and gas market where it could sort of paper over a lot of problems. Algeria's been in a position for about 8 years now where that's sort of over, and there's some real economic suffering there. And I just don't know what Algeria is going to do. I think Algeria certainly needs a better governing system, and it needs more economic development. But how exactly that's all going to work together, I just don't know. I think one of the most key things that Algeria needs to benefit from the world globalization, achieve some economic development, of course, would be peace with Morocco, which is becoming more and more problematic and fraught. So I'm not very optimistic about that. I do say, though this brief period, especially because Algeria is a huge gas provider, and there are pipelines for Algeria to sell its gas to Europe. So the oil market has certainly been a nice boost, but Algeria being well positioned with those pipelines to Spain, I'd be surprised if much Algerian gas gets sold on to France or Germany, but they are participating in that same European energy market that is an extraordinary bonanza. So I think that the Algerian oligarchy has another sort of chance to try and do a few things for a couple of years, a couple of months. But I think in the long run, they're in the sort of the same position as the Saudis. Not to the point where, I think that it is inevitable. I think most people in Algeria probably would agree that it's inevitable that there be a switch in systems, or at least the age of the oligarchs running the place. But in Algeria, as traumatizing as that change must be, it's not going to be as traumatizing. I mean, it's nominally had a parliament, nominally had a political system, and it's had real elections at different periods, more or less real elections. I think the transition for Algeria is much smaller than the transition for Saudi Arabia, but I think that the state of Algeria's petroleum industry is much more dire than the state of the Saudi petroleum industry that's going to be able to continue to sell its incredibly cheaply extracted oil and gas for decades to come. Algeria is going to have more problems. Algeria, I think even beyond the whatever the sort of very spiky price environment we have right now, even after wind and solar and nuclear become bigger factors on Europe again, Algeria is now in a position where it's probably going to be, assuming that Putin survives, Algeria is probably going to be one of the last big gas suppliers to the European market, and that could potentially go on, for a century. but at smaller and smaller and smaller amounts. So Algeria is actually better positioned, because much better positioned because of this Russia-Ukraine thing. I mean, I assume, is Algeria the second largest provider of natural gas to Europe? I feel like it might be after Russia. But yeah, so yeah, that's me blathering on Algeria's future. Any more super chats? Anybody, anybody got some more super chats? Let's see. Questions. Daxton Min, does all of your income come from just YouTube, Rob, or do you have another job? All of my income comes from YouTube, from Patreon, from the books and essays that I sell. All of that definitely comes from that. That does not cover my New York lifestyle at all. I've been pretty open about this. This is my third or fourth career. I was a corporate attorney in Turkey for a couple of years, which paid nowhere near what it would have paid in New York, but paid enough for me to save a lot of money. And I got very, 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 very lucky with investments that I made with that money. So I think in earlier years of this podcast, there was a lot of me, the earlier years of this channel, there was a lot of me doing like YouTube from a mattress I was staying on at my buddy's place. Now I have a much nicer living situation, mostly because of Elon Musk, to be quite frank. I bought some Tesla stock about 10 years ago. And if any of you guys know anything about investing, that went pretty well. And then there were some other investments that I made that went pretty well. So I was very lucky. So it has not gotten me to the point where I am capable of. It has not gotten me to the point where I am capable of retiring and just doing this for the rest of my life. But it has given me sort of another, the ability to keep trying to make this viable and make this something that pays for my New York lifestyle. For another 3 or 4 years. I think at a certain point, honestly, this past fall, I was thinking of giving up, not necessarily because of money issues. Tesla stock keeps going up, but simply just because I wasn't having reach and was having smaller reach than I used to. So yeah, I'm definitely going to be able to do this for another year or so if things keep getting bigger. But at some point, I'll have to either, at some point, I'll just have to probably move out of New York City. But anyway, if I want to keep doing this, maybe I'll try and do something else. Who knows? Maybe I'll marry rich. Find that sugar mama I've always been looking for. Anyway, Toad Films. We've got a couple Staro Pulsaro. But yeah, to answer your question, yes, I make the entirety of my income comes from my More Freedom Foundation related online businesses, and it nowhere near pays for my lifestyle as a 43-year-old in New York City. Do you think Saudi Arabia will collapse by 2030? Absolutely. Absolutely. More so. I think that I was very lucky, supernaturally lucky, with that video called "How the Oil Market Dies." That video called "How the Oil Market Dies" that put up in 2018, talking about this is actually all the fact that we're seeing a price spike now was always part of the expectation, and it's actually happening almost exactly the way that I said it would in 2018. And I think that to the point where like that map that I had actually had like the in 2018 I actually had a price spike in 2022, which was kind of crazy. That's entirely luck. But more or less the dynamics that I expected with production going down and a massive price spike that is just contributing to the electrification of everything. So yeah, no, I would say that actually Russia's invasion of Ukraine, by bringing that price spike forward, that was always sort of inevitable, might actually have accelerated the potential of Saudi Arabia's collapse. An additional complication that I didn't quite budget for, and that I got very wrong with a video that I put out in 2018, where I think I mocked Saudi Arabia for buying into Tesla at a price that was much more than what I paid to buy in to Tesla, but I think it's still a tenth of what it's worth today. And yeah, I was wrong, and I've since done a video correcting it. Saudi Arabia's choice to spend a lot of money in U.S. equities markets seems to have worked better than I expected. I'm someone who's sort of somewhat constitutionally bearish. I'm always expecting the market to crash. At the next market crash, Saudi Arabia will be one of the biggest losers. And I think that the oil situation just gets worse and worse for Saudi Arabia. And I think that when a market crash happens in the United States, which it will happen, that will also involve wiping away an extraordinary amount of Saudi investment that has performed very well and been very successful recently. But I think if it crashes, will look less successful. Interestingly, I think there's already been a pretty tremendous shakeout in U.S. tech investments. And I think it's entirely possible, actually, that Saudi Arabia already has some rather large holes in its balance sheet or in the performance of, the public investment fund or what have you. But I haven't seen any reporting on that quite yet. But yes, Saro Saro, I definitely think that Saudi Arabia will collapse by 2030. Thoughts on the 2023 Turkish general election? I'm getting worried. I think that certainly when the Turkish currency was crashing, was that 2 or 3 months ago? I think a lot of us were like, a lot of longtime Turkey watchers, very few of us here in the West have much use for Erdogan, and many of us want Erdogan gone in a electoral sense, in a voting sense. I was a strong opponent of the coup, but no, we definitely. I think it is time for Erdogan to lose an election and to shuffle into hopefully a happy retirement. That is definitely what I want to happen in the 2023 Turkish general election, and with the economic collapse, currency collapse we were seeing a couple months ago. It was beginning. I think the conventional wisdom was that Erdogan was certain to lose that election in 2023. I think we're getting less confident in that as Russia and Ukraine have functioned to make Erdogan look like more of a serious actor on the world stage. Yeah, I think that is a real concern. That actually, it seems as though he's managed to stabilize the currency through some very strange financial innovation that I don't fully understand. It seems as though his, ability to keep interest rates relatively lower has actually led to some serious economic development or what have you. Yeah, I don't know. So I think the conventional wisdom remains that Turkey is enough of a democracy for Erdogan to lose an election. That is, remains the conventional wisdom. But I think it's looking a little shakier. If he can make the case by 2023 that the Turkish economy has turned the corner, he's more respected on the world stage because of his role with Russia and Ukraine. Zelensky is talking about Turkey acting as a security guarantor for Ukraine against Russia. This is a tremendous shift in Erdogan's positioning personally. So yeah, I don't know. It's a possibility that Erdogan could once again have pulled a rabbit out of a hat and survive another election, which would not be the result that I would prefer, of course. Do you see the future of Turkey differently than, let's say, you did 5 or 6 years ago? And if yes, how so? I think 5 or 6 years ago, I would have been. I made a video called "Why I'm Still Optimistic About Turkey." Everything I said in that video still applies. Um, I think even at that point, I had tremendous respect for Erdogan as a political actor and his survivability. I think that he may have been even more capable of wrapping reality around his finger and surviving longer than I had appreciated back then. But I don't think there's a real, because even back then I said, the AK Party could win in the next couple elections, and that would include 2023. Yeah, it's a shift. Oh wow, lots of super chats. Okay, Daxton Min, how can we boost U.S. immigration inflows? Ideal numbers. Honestly, I was pretty happy with 1 million people a year. I mean, to be clear, that's not the immigration inflows. I think we let in a million, we gave 1 million people U.S. citizenship every year. That was sort of where we were at. And now we're at 250,000, that's the Trump effect, that's the COVID effect. I think about 1 million a year, new U.S. citizens, pretty solid. I was very okay with that. I think that's a good, solid number, manageable, like a 300th. Literally take a century to add a third of the people we currently have. I mean, historically speaking, that's tiny, absolutely tiny. I think we could probably handle 2 million a year. I don't think you can sell that. I know you can't sell that in the current political environment. But yeah, I would say like, 2 million. Adding 100th of the U.S. population in immigration every year seems amazing to me. That's so 3 million people. We totally could do it. I live in the Northeast. I live in New York City, which is one of the very few dynamic places left in the Northeast. We have cities filled with housing stock. Basically everything between here and fucking Colorado and Minneapolis. It's tons and tons of dying cities. We desperately need people. So yeah, I'd say 3 million people a year would be good. So like, the point where we'd have as many people as we have. It would take a century to have as many people as we have today, with 3 million people a year. I think that's great. We went from 1 million people a year, which is sort of the norm, I think, in the 21st century. Now we're at like 250,000 a year, and that's bullshit. Despite the threat of a parallel government, why does Libya's peace remains to hold, and will it continue until elections? Europe is diverting from Russian oil. Can this translate into a stable Libya? S. Allen. So I think the Europe diverting from Russian oil is important. Libya just has, I think Libya being right across, from Italy, which is, some forget this, but Italy is very much a heavily developed first world country. Libyan oil was always more attractive to Italy than Russian oil was, simply because of the ease of transition and getting there. I think Libya has largely remained at peace over the past year, in part for the same reason that Lebanon remained at peace throughout the course of the Syrian civil war, despite a place that it was deeply integrated with falling apart economically. It was because Libya's peace remains to hold, I think, because the Libyans are just fucking sick of war. And I think also most of the players in Libya, including Haftar, the strongman who tried to impose himself recently, have just, in 2019, have just realized that how much of a dead end military approach and military attacks are. So I think that's sort of how, because even with the very hopeful political situation in Libya that sort of came together last spring, more or less. I think it was February, March of last year. Very hopeful political situation became the case in Libya. Even with that falling apart, the peace has held. Oil and gas production has gone up. My understanding is that even some Libyans are returning. Economic development is going up. The fighting has stopped in Libya, even though there is not yet a functioning government. And that's why it's a sense of like, it's not just like it's not as if, oh, well, the peace isn't working and war is going to start again. The threat, and there's a real concern that, like, if this political situation falls apart, war will really restart. And that is a tremendous fear because Libya actually has already begun to recover. And yes, absolutely, Europe diverting from Russian oil and the current price environment is great for Libya. But we need a government, I think is the thing. Alan, there needs to be a government in Libya that both sides can agree upon. And that is a vital, vital, vital part of this that has yet to materialize. Toad Films asks, does the invasion of Ukraine affect Egypt in any way regarding their Nile Dam conflict with Ethiopia, or has that already calmed down? I think that I think Egypt has bigger problems. I mean, of course, there's no bigger problem, no bigger potential problem than a dam with control over the Nile. It's an existential issue for Egypt. But I think that Ethiopia is not in fact shutting down the Nile or anything of that to that effect. But does this invasion of Ukraine affect Egypt in any way? I think that something that China might have to think about, that Egypt might have to think about, anybody who's considering invading somebody has to consider what the impact of that is in public relations. And I think that that's a consideration, certainly for China and perhaps for Egypt as well. It's like, oh, really, if we were going to go in and sort of, do this in bombing and invasion of this really poor country. And I think that it was already a small, much slimmer chance, obviously, than Russia going into Ukraine or China going into Taiwan. I just feel like there's the fact that Egypt is probably going to is potentially going to have to deal with dramatic rise in food insecurity. The fact that invading a country just doesn't look that good, and the fact that the U.S. would definitely frown upon such an action. I feel like Egypt's probably not gonna. I think it's probably gotten a little less likely to risk it. However, I would not say that conflict has calmed down. It's interesting. What has calmed down in Ethiopia is the war between Ethiopia and Tigray, which, don't get me wrong, is very much still ongoing. But I think they're trying to find some kind of peace process, and I really do hope that they do. Egypt's conflict over the dam will be long-standing. It will be eternal, and it'll be a source of great tension. But I haven't heard anything about it that's particularly novel recently. Toad Films. Of course, another interpretation would be like, well, now that everybody's so focused on Russia and Ukraine, maybe Egypt can get away with doing more stuff. But I think it just involves like sort of hideous levels of complexity. Yeah. Yeah, so an actual Egyptian attack on Ethiopia would introduce sort of horrific risk and complexity that I would hope that Egypt would want to avoid, because at this point, Ethiopia is never not going to control the sources of the Nile, and I think that Egypt's potential to actually destroy that dam, I think it has that power. It has those planes. It has those, but what's to stop Ethiopia from acting in smaller ways to divert that water, and much more actively and maliciously if Egypt destroys this great Ethiopian symbol. So yeah. Fadel says, I think you're too optimistic about Turkey and Iran, especially. And I think Iran especially. I'm not super optimistic about Iran, and too pessimistic about the Arab countries. That may well be very true, Fadl, but that is my take. Thoughts on the Hungarian election, Star Pulsar? Um, I haven't read a single article on the Hungarian election. I have skimmed a couple. My sense is that Viktor Orban's opponent was a bit of a dud. I've certainly read a lot of hopeful profiles of him, but didn't appear to lead to much success, unfortunately. I've talked a lot about how I have been convinced, and I have looked into it enough to get the sense that Orban is a bad guy. You're never going to get, my endorsement for forcing the shutting down of a university, which he did. His control over media is truly unfortunate. It is a real, Hungary's politics and Viktor Orban's positioning within those politics are malign. It is a shame that he won again. However, I do think there's also, so I don't want to sound like a national conservative or whatever, but I do think that the degree of panic, less over Hungary, but more over Poland, that we are all expected to just sort of nod along with when it comes to Poland and Hungary making their own decisions as to how they run their countries. I feel like that's a little overblown. I'm not saying it's entirely overblown, but I do think that there's definitely some elements when I look at European politics and sort of the Brussels reaction to Hungary and Poland, I do think it's a little overblown. And there is an element of, we give you all this money, you should do what we want. That's a little unattractive, I think. Yeah. So, however, yeah, I would have been happier if Orban had lost, obviously. What does Russia even... Oh, super chat. Thoughts on India's neutrality on Ukraine? I don't think it's particularly surprising. I don't think it's something that... I think that the instinct in the U.S., as with everything, is to demonize people who don't do exactly what we want all the time. I think it would be wiser to look at India's neutrality on Ukraine, India's approach to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, to look at it as an opportunity, to look at it as this is somebody we have to sell. This is our metric. How does India feel about Russia today? How does India feel about U.S. efforts to get Russia out of Ukraine today? I think there should be a much broader scope for public diplomacy work. Where's the I mean, I guess I'm sure we've got Voice of America or whatnot, but it was, where's the RT equivalent in India? The Russia Today equivalent in India, selling U.S. actions in Russia and Ukraine. I think that we shouldn't look at the fact that India is leery of abandoning one of their longest term allies as some great crime that India is committing. I think we should look at it as something as a sign of how persuasive we're being in making the case against Russia, and we should look at it as a challenge for our public diplomacy, for our diplomats, rather than something that we should we sanction that? I think that sanctioning India over its neutrality on Ukraine, over its continued purchasing of Russian oil, which I don't believe has been openly suggested by any diplomats now, but it is already, I'm sure, being discussed informally. I think that's insane. So yeah. Let's see. Okay, so I think we're closing down. I've answered all the super chats. Let me answer any TikTok questions. That's funny. After Trump's hate rallies, well, okay, 200%. No, it's mostly just people angry. TikTok, they mostly seem to be angry. Oh, good Lord, jeez, CRC 1500. I don't even know what that is. Thoughts on Costa Rican elections? I am afraid I don't have any thoughts on Costa Rican elections. Can say that I love Costa Rica. I can say that I think Costa Rica is a country that I think a lot of folks could stand to learn from. I wish that more countries had followed Costa Rica's example. I was in the 1940s or the 1950s. Maybe perhaps you can tell me, Daniel Casada. Costa Rica basically just decided, you know what? We don't really want to have a military. And I think you can make an argument that that was, placing way too much trust in the United States or what have you, to sort of police the region, but it's worked. And because Costa Rica didn't have a military for the United States to use to, fuck up Costa Rica the way that we destroyed every other Central American country, Costa Rica is a infinitely happier country than any of its neighbors. And it's just a beautiful place. If you ever have the opportunity to go to Costa Rica, I would do that. It's an extraordinary place of natural beauty, lovely people. I lived there for a month on sort of like a high school trip, and I always think very fondly of Costa Rica. Unfortunately, I don't know a damn thing about Costa Rica's elections. I don't know if they're impending. I don't know if they're. What's just Costa Rica elections? And I think, as with Canada, I think I've actually have been learning a little more about Canada recently, which is probably something to worry about. So one day ago, we've got pro-market economist wins Costa Rica presidential election. And how's that for counterintuitive, right? You've got a big pink wave going on in Costa Rica, and we've got a pro-market economist winning in Costa Rica. Who knew? But yeah, Costa Rica is, and the way that Canada used to benefit from is just, I don't know anything about it because it's boring, because it's generally well run, because there aren't a lot of huge tensions there. And of course, nothing lasts forever. I'm certain that Costa Rica has real challenges and real problems. But yeah, I'm afraid I don't have anything to say about Costa Rica's election, Daniel Casada. 1948 was when they abolished their military. But thank you for the super chat, Daniel Casada. Star Pulsara, will the U.S. ever do another Marshall Plan to combat China's Belt and Road investments around the world? No. Yeah, it's quite simple. It's just maybe I'm getting a little too wooed by Peter Zeihan on this, but it's just true, just the extent to which the U.S. foreign policy in the United States is just, it's just more fodder for domestic culture war bullshit. Nobody in U.S. there are people in the U.S. State Department and the Pentagon. There are U.S. government figures who can read a map and know where places are and know who's in charge of them, and try to develop U.S. business interests in these places, or sell weapons to them. But it's just not really a factor in U.S. politics. You have to understand, with the Marshall Plan, it was in the context of the U.S. being very conscious that when the world can wound us and can create problems for us. But that's not really something that we haven't had a real threat from communism, honestly, since like the 1960s. I would argue we sort of won the Cold War in 1956. And you can see there's a real qualitative shift in how good of a job we do helping other countries and setting up other countries. Whereas, Taiwan and South Korea, countries that were sort of had most heavily under U.S. influence during a period of time when the U.S. felt legitimately threatened and legitimately cared about setting up allies, and the Marshall Plan comes from this era as well, of course. The results were a lot better. Whereas, the nation-building projects, we've undertaken in the Reagan era are just nightmares. We basically just, try to do libertarian playbooks that fail in Kentucky and then obviously fail in places like Iraq. Or was it Kansas? Was the place that famously had, just did this hyper libertarian set of policies that were just obscene failures everywhere. I think it was Kentucky, or was it Kansas? Was Sam Brownback? Anyway, um, so yeah, we simply don't care enough about the world outside, and there isn't any real threat from the world outside. There just isn't, the way there was during dealing with Japanese and the Nazis and the early decades of the Cold War. Um, yeah, and I mean China's Belt and Road isn't currently seen by many to be currently that successful. Okay, I'm gonna just start spieling outside of super chats. Did I miss any super chats? Um, uh, my name is Robert Morris. I try to do something every Tuesday. Sometimes a more produced video. Um, Sometimes a more produced video. Sometimes a live chat like this. Sometimes just a rant. YouTube now basically requires videos to be over 10 minutes long. I find those more difficult to produce. So while I used to produce 5 or 6 produced videos a month when they were 3 to 5 minutes long, they're now 15 to 20 minutes long. So I really only manage like 2 a month, which bums me out, but it is what it is. Anyway, so join me every Tuesday on YouTube. Every morning, I also upload shorts that talk about stuff, which are mostly just mini rants. I'm on TikTok at the More Freedom Foundation. I'm on Twitter at RoboLaw. That's a really fun place to reach out to me. Probably spend way too much time on Twitter now that Elon Musk now owns 10% of Twitter. Jeez. Twitter at RoboLaw. We have a Discord. This channel is entirely supported by patrons. You need to, if you hop on you can support me through Patreon. You can support me through PayPal. With Patreon, sort of an ongoing Kickstarter, you get access to a patrons-only newscast once a month, which is like this, except I try to cover everything that folks want me to, and I do a little more research. Like if you were a patron, Daniel Casada, you would ask me to cover the Costa Rican election, and then I would spend the 20 minutes to a half hour necessary to have something to say about the Costa Rican election. So that's a fun thing that we do once a month. We also have a Discord server that is only available to patrons. That's a lot of fun. That's continuous, ongoing discussion as well. And once a month, in addition to the patrons-only newscast, we also do like sort of a patrons-only Zoom call on Discord once a month, which is a lot of fun. So if you want to access the Discord server, you've got to sign up on Patreon. I've written a couple books. One called, Everybody's Lying About Islam, which is pretty relevant to what we've been discussing today. The U.S.-Saudi relationship and how that was at the root of most worldwide terrorism. And I've also written Avoiding the British Empire, which is a massive, Avoiding the British Empire, which is a massive book that attempts to sort of explain all of world history. Sorry, a little out of it today, but still here. 2 hours, 5 minutes in. James Parker, new question. How legitimate is it for countries to go after other countries who are diverting their main source of water, in your opinion? That's a very interesting question. And it's something that comes up a lot. Turkey has pretty much almost entirely run off with Iraq's water in recent decades, with Iraq being pretty much on its ass. The U.S. is obligated to provide a certain amount of water to Mexico. I think we still meet those obligations, but it's, how legitimate is it for countries to go after? I think there's a lot of everything in that question, James Parker, I think is, there's just, every word in that is something that has got 5 levels to it. Legitimate according to what? According to international law, according to my innate sense of justice. I think that if Ethiopia were to start the Grand Renaissance Dam and say, you know what, we're filling this over the next 6 months, so Sudan and Egypt aren't getting any water for the next 6 months. Sorry, we're doing that. In that case, I think it wouldn't just be legitimate. I think it'd be entirely appropriate for Egypt to bomb the shit out of the dam and, you know, try to kill everybody in the Ethiopian government. But Ethiopia is not not proposing to do that. They're proposing to fill the dam over the course of, is it 15 years or something like that? I think that it's entirely legitimate for Egypt to insist on some kind of treaty governing how that happens. I think that it's not like just because you have the source of the water, you can do whatever you want with it. I think that's actually the way it's always worked. But I do think it makes sense for Ethiopia to reassure the Sudanese and the Egyptians and to not act to shut off their main source of water. But they're not doing that. So, no, I think it's a very legitimate concern. I was surprised when I was researching stuff about water wars and sort of mocking it, and I looked into it. I was like, oh yeah, no, like Turkey pretty much is just really, 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 really screwed over Iraq almost entirely. And I was surprised the extent to which it had with the Tigris and the Euphrates. I think that Iraq has a very good case for further treaties or some kind of international arbitration to get more water out of Turkey. But, you know, Iraq is tremendously weak, and Turkey is very strong. And that's a real pity. But I would not endorse like terrorist actions by Iraq, or certainly it would be very unwise if you want a quick jump towards Turkey controlling, taking over Iraq again. That would be Iraq attempting to attack Turkey for abuse of water resources. So yeah, it is. Oh, Jesus. A local cool extreme says, I think a Turkish president said, the Arabs have oil, but we have water. Let them drink oil. That's pretty grim. Okay, folks, it's been 2 hours and 10 minutes. I think I've apologies. I feel like I was just a little low energy today. But this has been phenomenal. And thank you all for being here. And yeah, really grateful. I think hopefully next week I should have a produced video on Ray Dalio's Global Order book. All right, thank you so much.